Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on the third part of the Origins of American Government, which is titled The Road of Independence, or Road to Independence, I should say. My name is Paul Schneider. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. Some quick ways of being able to contact myself, the rest of the educational team, as well as our Student Services Department is 1-888-427-1000. If you want to get to myself or the rest of the educational team, you'll be able to choose option 5 from the phone system. Option 6 is your ability to be able to speak with one of our Student Services Department members. By email, the education team, we're able to be talked to by the edserv at pennfoster.edu. It comes into a system within the education department and then comes to the high school department. Either an instructor or one of the teaching assistants would be able to help you out in either way, by phone or by email. We're certainly available, certainly willing and able to help you out, and we want to help you. That is exactly why we're here, why we want to be able to support you all in your work towards your high school diploma. So please, if you do have questions, let us know. Get in touch with us to be able to, get the support and the help that you need. In terms of the objectives for today, first off, I always like to start off the webinars with just kind of the basic requirements of the lesson, make sure that we're all on the same page. And then content itself will outline some of the events leading up to the American Revolution, as well as the significance of a couple of battles, the Battle of Bunker Hill, as well as when the tide sort of turned in the Revolutionary War as well. And then finally, outlining the Articles of Confederation will be the last part that we'll talk about. So what is in your U.S. Civics course? Many of you are just starting off in Penn Foster. Hopefully you're having some success. Hopefully you're able to do pretty well in the program. Just as a quick reminder, I will ask for questions to be sort of held to the end of the webinar, just so I'm able to, go through what I want to be able to cover, and then, like I said, I'll be more than happy to go over any questions or problems that you guys have within the lessons. Sorry about that. But in terms of what's within the course, for each lesson, you do have a set of reading assignments. And within those reading assignments, you have objectives, which are really important to go over. Knowing what your objectives are, knowing what you're expected to know as you're reading or once you're done reading that section of the study unit, the reading assignments, that can really be beneficial in terms of being able to be comfortable with knowing what you've learned, understanding the material. And then along with those reading assignments, or within the reading assignments, you do also have both the self-checks as well as reflect and respond questions, or discover more questions. They, again, are very helpful in making sure that you're understanding what you've read. Between the objectives, the self-checks, the reflect and respond questions, really good ways of making sure that you're understanding the material. I often also recommend to students that they use the objectives as the ways of note-taking. If you're taking notes, if you're understanding the reading assignments based on the objectives, that ultimately helps you in preparing for the exams. And the exams for each of the lessons within U.S. Civics is multiple choice and open book. So you'll be able to, once you've read through the reading assignments, taken your notes, completed the self-checks and reflect and respond questions, you feel comfortable with that material, go into the exam and be able to start, preparing for the exams, be able to understand the material, be able to go back over your notes, go back over your study unit, your reading assignments, and be able to feel really comfortable in that material. So in terms of sort of the beginning events of the American Revolution, in my previous webinar on the origins of American government, I ended with some of the early attacks of the British against the freedoms and against the the independence of the American colonies. And they really helped kind of build up to the need of the colonists to organize. And their first major attempts at as an organization was what's called the Patriot Bodies of Correspondence. And what this ended up doing, it wasn't a formal group, but it was an organization of all of the colonial leaders, the revolutionary leaders within each of the colonies. And many groups of colonists sort of had different views of what they wanted. The most revolutionary members of the Patriot Bodies were the folks in mainly Massachusetts, but in sort of in that New England area of the colonies, the most northern. They were really interested in becoming free from Britain. Colonists from states like the colonies from Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, they were a little less interested. They weren't sure completely whether or not they wanted independence. And even when the groups got together as a First Continental Congress, they were still sort of unsure of what they wanted to do. So they created a petition to King George III of England, and proclaiming that they weren't satisfied with how things were going. And the Patriot Bodies of Correspondence was in 1772. The First Continental Congress was 1775. And they really wanted to let the British know that they weren't happy. Again, they weren't coming all to the point of wanting a revolution, wanting to be independent from Britain, but they weren't satisfied. So their main point within the petition was to say that the Parliament, that the king himself, did not have the power to tax the colonies because there was no colonial representation within Parliament. If you remember back to the previous Origins webinars, we talked about the fact that the Parliament became sort of the Congress of the British, and the members of Parliament were only folks within Britain, within England. So they were at the time when the Parliament was first created, it was very revolutionary to believe that that the representatives of the people were helping to make laws, particularly in taxing. But as the British Empire expanded and gained colonies in North America, Africa, Asia, the Parliament still only was representing those in England. So all the colonies that Britain had, no one was represented. And that was the major issue that the colonists really had towards the British. They still generally, as a group, wanted to work within British control. There was sort of this sense of wanting to go back to how the colonies were managed before the French and Indian War, before 1763. Because at that time, the British really allowed the colonies to run themselves. There were regional governors that the king was able to select that would run the colonies. But in general, the British, the Crown, King George and his predecessors really let the colonies run. There weren't a whole lot of taxes that were separate from just being part of the British Empire. They had a lot of freedom. But by the time of the First Continental Congress, the colonies really felt had far less power, had far less autonomy from the British. And this leads us to our first poll question. And that question, what point did the First Continental Congress try to make to King George III? That Parliament has the power to tax the colonies, that the Parliament does not have power to tax the colonies, or that the king only had the power to tax? Give you guys about 10 seconds. Which of those options was part of what the First Continental Congress sent to King George? Finishing up in 3, 2, 1. Fantastic. So 100% of you absolutely correct that the Parliament does not have the power to tax. So even though the Parliament was a representative government at the time, they were not representing those within colonies. So that was a major issue that the colonists really had at this point. They weren't ready. They weren't ready to go to revolution. They weren't ready to proclaim themselves free from Britain. But the First Continental Congress was ready to say, look, we're not happy. We want some changes made between our relationship between the colonies and the British. Well, as you can guess, King George III basically ignored this request, this belief that the colonies had, and he really started strengthening the army within the colonies. He started sending more soldiers to areas like Boston, Massachusetts, to control what he felt was sort of a growing revolution, growing resentment towards the king, towards Parliament, towards the empire. And the first battle of what became known as the American Revolution occurred right outside of Boston at Bunker Hill. So the British were in control of the city of Boston, and the colonists, a small group of a colonial militia, held this Bunker Hill and some of the surrounding hills around Boston. Well, the British weren't too pleased with this. They decided that they really wanted to take control back from the colonies. They didn't want to be essentially surrounded by colonists. Now, the colonists were not well equipped at this point. They were not well trained at this point. So this was really just a group of farmers who had guns, who were just kind of hanging out outside of a hill and thinking that they were going to take on the British. Well, the British were the most disciplined, most organized military in the world. So it was essentially the United States of the time that had a powerful army, had a ready army, and could dominate just about any army in the world. And what the British ended up doing was sending. They believed that they could just rush the hill and be able to take it easily. Well, the colonists were able to stay very disciplined. This was really the hallmark of this battle for the colonists. That through 3 waves of British attacks, British marching onto the hill, the American colonists, the colonial army, was able to hold steady. They knew they had few resources. They knew they had few bullets, so they were able to hold off. And as the British marched onto them, they waited until the British were close enough. To quote a famous idea, we were going to wait until we could see the whites in their eyes. They wanted the British to be close enough so they didn't waste any bullets. Well, after the third wave, or at the third wave that the British sent, the colonists ran out of bullets. And they had to retreat. They had to run away from the battle. The British did take the hill. However, this is still sort of considered an inconclusive battle. The British were able to take the hill. They were able to be victorious. However, the British lost a lot of soldiers. They lost over 1,000 soldiers in the 3 waves that they attacked the colonists. And the colonists were able to show that they could stand up to the British. In a conventional battle, they were going to lose. They were going to lose in the attempts at being a disciplined army. But they at least were able to stand up to the British. They needed, if they had more training, if they had more resources, they might have been able to hold off the British. And this leads us to our next poll question. Why was the Battle of Bunker Hill considered inconclusive? So that the British took the hill, that neither side was able to advance on the hill, or that the colonists were able to hold the hill? Give you guys about another 5 seconds. A lot of votes already. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So the answer being that the British were able to take the hill, but the Americans were really able to show their strength, that they were able to stand up to the British. So this is a very important concept that is within the study unit, and that's within the objectives. That the Battle of Bunker Hill, again, even though the British took that hill, there was a lot of confidence within the Americans, within the colonists, that said, oh, we can actually stand up to the British. We can actually take them on and possibly be successful. Another major kind of key battle came in two events. The first one was Washington taking his army across the Delaware River in December, being able to defeat the German Haitians, essentially mercenaries, those that the British bought essentially their loyalty. That George Washington was able to bring a much more organized colonial army and be able to defeat the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey. They are then able to move into Princeton, New Jersey, and be able to start advancing within the northern colonies. This really increased the morale of the colonists and the Continental Army itself, and colonial leaders. So the revolutionary leaders were kind of becoming a little frightened in December of 1775. But with this battle, and also the battle in Saratoga, New York, the British were able to, the Americans attacked the British as well. So the British at this point, 1775, felt like they were winning the war, felt like they had the colonists on the ropes, ready to lose. So the British had this belief that if they held the northern colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that holding this land, holding these colonies, would eventually destroy the colonial army. That the colonial army wouldn't be able to get resources, wouldn't be able to have enough men to continue to fight into 1776, beyond the winter. Horatio Gates, a general within the American Continental Army, was able to defeat the British at Saratoga, New York, and were able to successfully cut off the British moving up into New England, moving up into the northern colonies. So this was a real turning point within the war, because the British now needed a new strategy. Between the attack on the Delaware River and then in Saratoga, New York, the British had two major defeats in the area that they felt they were strongest in. So the British had to now move to a more southern strategy, which would eventually help the Americans win the war by attacking more within the British as the British marched from city to city, and also allowed the American colonies to be able to start asking for help, particularly from the French and the Spanish, to be able to get resources and be able to get alliances with them to be able to win their independence from the United States, or from Great Britain. That leads us to our next poll question. Why was Saratoga considered a turning point in the war? That the British won the battle and the colonists were defeated. That the colonists won the war at that battle. That Washington attacked from the Delaware River. Or the colonists kept the British from controlling all of New England. Finishing up in 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you. So it was that the colonists were able to keep the British away from New England. They were able, again, push the British to have a more of a southern strategy, more of a rural strategy, so not able to keep the supplies away from the colonial army. Very nice job. So the last point that I wanted to talk about today was about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation became the first Constitution of the United States. It would not become the last. There had to be a replacement. But after the Declaration of Independence was created, our founding fathers decided that they needed to start thinking about what a new government would look like. In 1776, we were far from winning the Revolutionary War, but many of our leaders decided they needed to start thinking about and start organizing what our government would look like. So we our founders started creating an original draft of the Articles of Confederation. The first draft set up a strong central government, a strong federal government with large control of the colonies, or what would become the United States. It also called for that the Western lands would be in complete control of the federal government, and then equal representation of all the colonies and all the states would be in the government. So within the Congress, each state would have equal representation. Well, the big change that occurred to the second draft, or what would become the final draft, was a much more weak central government. After being held by the British for so long, the last thing that our founders and the colonists really wanted was another strong central government, a strong federal government. People wanted to have more power within the states, more power within the local governments. So the Articles would eventually become a much weaker central government, and that became its downfall. Once the government came to be after the American Revolution, our founders, our political leaders, really found that a weak central government was not going to function. And the webinars that I'm holding on the U.S. Constitution lesson, the second lesson within the U.S. Civics course, really kind of covers that as well. The Western governments, the Western lands, did kind of stay the same. That the central government had a firm control or power over the Western lands that had not become states. The legislature stayed the same as having equal representation between all states. And the ratification did occur after the American Revolution did end. And as I mentioned, problems began to arise, which again is covered more into the U.S. Constitution lesson within U.S. Civics. So at this point, I am open for questions. I want to thank you for attending.